Our gospel lesson comes from Luke's gospel, the 6th chapter, verses 27 through 38, and I invite you to listen to the word. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I am fairly confident that everyone in this room has heard of Rodgers and Hammerstein, right? I mean, even if you are not a musical theater buff, you know Rodgers and Hammerstein, because probably everyone in this room has seen or at least heard of The Sound of Music, right? I mean, boy, we all know that one. Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rodgers and Hammerstein gave us musicals that became hit movies. Besides The Sound of Music, there's Oklahoma, State Fair, Carousel, and South Pacific, to name a few. What you may not realize watching these movies is that Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals were actually social commentaries of the time. And these two men addressed issues in those musicals that weren't normally viewed or addressed. Things like domestic violence, stalking, suicide, racism, and complicity are all found and addressed in these musicals. And you don't know that if you've only seen the movie versions, because those scenes and those songs were removed. And they gave us those light, lovely musicals that we enjoy. In the musical Oklahoma, for the movie, the powerful soliloquy called Lonely Room was removed. And this song was a solemn confession of a man obsessed with a young woman, an obsession that leads to his death. Oh, I should warn you, there's probably going to, if you haven't seen these, there's going to be some spoiler alerts, just so you know. In The Sound of Music, there were 3 songs that were actually removed, 2 of which were done so they could replace them with other songs. But the third one that is removed is a song called No Way to Stop It. And it is a song that is actually sung by the Baroness and Max, encouraging Captain Von Trapp to not resist the Nazi regime as it peacefully takes over Austria. It is a song about complicity and a song about self-absorption. As long as it doesn't affect us, why fight it? The most controversial of their songs, however, comes from South Pacific. And there were states that threatened to ban the movie if the song was included in the movie. This song, according to them, supposedly promoted a communist agenda And the state of Georgia actually threatened to pass a law that would ban any movie that included such issues. And the song was removed from the movie, and it's called You've Got to Be Taught. Sometimes also called You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. Here's the words. I think you'll hear why. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8. To hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be carefully taught. This song came to my mind this week while I was reflecting on this passage from Luke. Because the question that kept swirling around in my mind was this: how do we know our enemy? How do we know who to be afraid of? How do we know who is a threat to us, our lives, our livelihoods, to our values? How do we know? I think the song kind of answers it. This section that we've read this morning is a continuation of Jesus' sermon that we began last week with those blessings and woes, where Jesus has placed everyone on the same level in terms of their value in the kingdom of God. And then he says this: love your enemy. And I think the first question we have, which is probably the first question that they had back then, because human nature has not changed all that much, is, who is my enemy? A question that is asked not because we want to make sure we are loving them, but in the hopes that who Jesus is referring to as maybe our frenemies. Have you all heard that word? It's a mashup of friend and enemy. Think back to middle school. That person that you were friends with one day, and the next day you hated each other, and then you were friends again, and on, frenemies. The hope that that is who Jesus is maybe referring to, not those that we have been taught to hate. And the descriptions that Jesus gives shows us that people were thinking that way. They're thinking in terms of the transactional, tit-for-tat, quid pro quo world that they lived in. Because all relationships in the Roman Empire were viewed in such a way. They were transactional. Even friendships were more about how you could get ahead, making sure you did favors for and hung out with those who could give you a boost up. You wanted to make sure that the right people were the ones that you did favors for. That way they owed you one. Marriages were transactional in the same way. Children were viewed as resources that could be shuffled out to work in ways that boosted your status, your wealth. That was the way the world worked. And to quote the Baroness and Max, there was no way to stop it. Just as Jesus' proclamations of blessing and woes flipped the tables, so does his command here to love your enemy. And the Greek word that is used for enemy here is not reference to a war. It's not reference to military might or anything like that. It's about hatred, hostility. It's about the more personal terms of the various relationships of everyday life. This is about the people around us that we view as a threat to us in some way. Those who take but never give. Those who we see ourselves in competition with. Those we think threaten our values, our way of life. It's about those people we have been carefully taught to hate. And just as Jesus leveled the plain between rich and poor, content and grieving, the respected and the disrespected, in the blessings and woes, so the leveling continues here. Enemies are not only to be forgiven, but like friends, they are to be loved, blessed, and prayed for. Enemies are on equal footing with friends. In a world that revolved on a cycle of retribution and violence, this act of giving, this act of love, is an act of resistance. Because the act of giving one's cloak or lending without hope of return was seen as a futile action, and Jesus is declaring, no, it's not a futile action. Turning the other cheek was contradictory to the eye for an eye, or actually more truthfully, an eye for an eyelash mentality that surrounded them. It flies in the face of that common wisdom that relationships were built on the exchange of gifts. And so these statements are radical, shocking acts of resistant love. They are examples of God's radical, resistant love that is revealed to us in the person of Christ. And just as the disciples then were called to reflect that resistant love, so too are we. We live in a world that is determined to divide us, to make us into enemies. We hear it everywhere. From shadowy, undefined threats of other nations to the neighbor who flies a different flag from their front porch, we are taught to view each other with suspicion, even those who try to do something nice for us. Because our first thought is often, what's in it for them? We are taught to shift blame and accountability to another group, making them not only scapegoats, but threats to our way of life, rather than owning up to the ways that we have sinned. The language that is used constantly builds on and builds up our fear of each other, so that anyone who is different in any way, even if it's just a difference of opinion, is to be viewed as the enemy. The ones we can dismiss, the ones we can blame, the ones we can treat as less than human, the ones we can treat as less than children of God. And we do. In that worldview, loving one's enemy is a radical act of resistance. Loving one's enemy, turning the other cheek. These are not weak, passive acts of complicity, because it's not about condoning damaging behaviors, making excuses for it, and so on. To be kind does not mean to approve. It means to seek the best interest of all. And making that claim means that we look at things through a different worldview, one that is grounded in our identity as God's children. When we understand that our actions, all of our actions, are a flowing out of God's abundant love, turning the other cheek becomes an act of resistance to evil and that has the power to transform ourselves, others, and the world. Jesus offers a counter way to resist the tit for tat of the present age, not a suggestion to be passive in the face of it. When we live into the exhortation of this sermon in the face of the world's violence, we are collectively saying to those who hate, abuse, strike, judge, and condemn, you are not the boss of us. We are demonstrating that bad behavior cannot goad us into reacting in kind. We are living in resistant love. We have been taught who to hate, who to view as enemies. But we have also been taught to love. To love those that our little world bubble tells us to hate. To love those the pundits constantly proclaim are a threat to us. To love those who have nothing to give to us in return. And that flies in the face of conventional wisdom because, like it or not, we too live in a very transactional world where everything is viewed as commodity and even love supposedly can be bought or sold. But the love of God cannot be bought or sold. It's given to all on that level place. It's given to all. Those we call friends, those we call frenemies, those we call enemies. That is the love we are called on to let flow through us. And it will take strength to love that way. It will take courage to love that way. But the good news is that nothing can defeat God's love. Nothing. It's that resistant, and it resists. Amen.